The folder hit the kitchen island so hard that the clasp cracked open and papers slid across the marble like something had been waiting all morning to escape. Selene Voss, 37 years old, stood at the counter with a coffee mug halfway to her lips. She didn't flinch. She had learned a long time ago not to flinch in front of her husband. Kieran Voss, 41 years old, Chief Operating Officer of Aldgate Property Group, stood on the other side of the island with his jaw tight and his eyes doing that thing they did when he had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it began. "Explain that," he said. Selene set the mug down. She looked at the papers. She recognized the letterhead. It was from the Aldgate Legal Department. She recognized the account numbers. She did not recognize her own signature at the bottom of the wire transfer authorization. "I didn't sign this," she said.
"Your name is on it." I said I didn't sign it.
Kieran pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and sat down slowly the way he always did when he wanted to seem measured. He was good at seeming measured. It was one of the first things she had noticed about him when they met at a real estate conference in Atlanta 14 years ago. That ability to appear calm in rooms where everyone else was losing composure. She had found it attractive once. Now she understood it for what it was. "The compliance team flagged it," he said. "Selene, $4.2 million moved out of the Aldgate Residential Acquisition Fund through a co-authorization that has your signature and mine. The money went to a holding entity that no one in the firm can trace. Legal is already involved." She looked at the signature again. It was close. It was very close, but the loop on the S was wrong, just slightly. The way a copy is always slightly wrong no matter how careful the hand. "Someone forged it," she said. Kieran said nothing. She looked up at him. He was watching her with something that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite anger. It was something more carefully calibrated than either of those things. "Kieran," she said, "someone forged my signature. The investigation will determine that." Those 4 words arrived in the kitchen like a temperature drop. "The investigation will determine that." Not, "I believe you." Not, "We'll figure this out together." Not even the performance of concern he usually managed when things went sideways. Just those 4 flat words, and beneath them, a door swinging shut. Selene Voss had not always been easy to underestimate. Before she married Kieran, before she moved her entire life to Charleston and folded it into his, she had been Selene Okafor, daughter of Augustine Okafor, who had built the Okafor Land Trust out of a single 40-acre parcel in rural Georgia and watched it grow into one of the most quietly influential private landholding entities in the southeastern United States. Her father did not advertise this. He drove the same Ford pickup he'd had since 2003. He wore reading glasses from the drugstore. He mispronounced the names of the restaurants his daughter took him to, because he found it funny, not because he didn't know better. Selene had inherited his instinct for quiet. When she joined Aldgate as a development consultant 15 years ago, she had done the work that no one else wanted. The environmental assessments, the community impact reports, the long negotiations with county boards and historic preservation committees. She was patient and precise, and she remembered everything. Kieran had noticed her because she was the only person in the firm who had ever corrected him in front of a client and been right. They married after 3 years. She left her consultant role when the firm's ethics policy flagged the spousal conflict. She started running the Okafor Land Trust full-time remotely, managing her father's portfolio from their house in the Ansonborough neighborhood of Charleston, making decisions worth tens of millions of dollars from a home office that looked out over a garden. She kept herself. Nobody at Aldgate really knew what she did with her days. That had been fine with her. It turned out to be a mistake. The compliance team's investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, Selene had been asked to submit to a formal interview. Within 3, she had received a letter informing her that the Charleston County District Attorney's Office had opened a preliminary inquiry into potential wire fraud and breach of fiduciary duty related to the unauthorized movement of Aldgate funds. The authorization was the problem. Legally, Aldgate's acquisition fund required dual sign-off for any transfer over $2 million. The document on file bore 2 signatures, Kieran's and Selene's. Kieran's was verified as authentic. The question. According to the investigators, according to the DA's office, according to every document Selene's attorney received, was whether hers was. Her attorney was a woman named Philippa Crane, 62 years old, who had been practicing white-collar defense in South Carolina for 30 years and who had the energy of someone who found incompetence personally offensive. "The signature analysis is going to be crucial," Philippa told her. "I've already retained an independent forensic documents examiner, but I need you to tell me everything. Not the version you've been telling everyone else. Everything." Selene told her everything, including the things she had not said out loud yet, even to herself. Kieran had been distracted for over a year. She had noticed it first as small absences, his phone face down on the counter, calls he took in the garage, a weekend trip to Charlotte, for what he said was a developer conference that she had not been able to find any record of when she looked later. She had not confronted him. She had watched and waited and filed information the way her father had taught her to file information, quietly in a place where it would be useful when she needed it. She told Philippa about a woman named Tanner Sherbrooke. Tanner Sherbrooke, 33 years old, was an acquisitions associate at a competing Charleston firm. Selene had first seen her name in an email thread she wasn't supposed to see. Kieran had left his laptop open on the kitchen table and walked out to take a phone call, and Selene had glanced over and seen the thread subject line, Richmond Parcels, Tanner S. follow-up. She hadn't read further. She didn't need to, because the thread had been organized under a personal Gmail account, not his Aldgate email, and Kieran used his Aldgate email for everything work-related. She knew that because she had been married to him for 11 years. She told Philippa about the wire transfer. She told Philippa that she had never, not once, been asked to co-authorize any Aldgate acquisition fund transfer since leaving the firm. She had never been presented with documents. She had never been contacted by Aldgate's legal team for any purpose. The co-authorization procedure required her signature on a physical document in front of a notary. That document, when Philippa requested it through Discovery, turned out to have been notarized by a man named Quentin Farwell, who worked as a closing coordinator at Aldgate. When Philippa's investigator went to interview Quentin Farwell, they discovered he had resigned 3 weeks before the investigation started and relocated to Florida. Selene listened to all of this in Philippa's conference room and thought about how long it must have taken someone to build it. The account, the document, the notary, the timeline. This was not an impulsive act. This was infrastructure. How much does your husband know about your family's holdings? Philippa asked. Everything, Selene said. He's known since before we were married. Philippa wrote something on her legal pad. And who controls the Okafor Land Trust currently? Selene's expression didn't change. I do, she said. My father transferred governance to me 18 months ago. Philippa looked up. He's 81, Selene said. He wanted it handled while he was still able to watch it be handled. The trust holds parcels in Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee. The current assessed portfolio value is approximately $340 million. There is no debt. Philippa set her pen down. Does your husband know the current portfolio value? He knows a version of it, Selene said. The version from 8 years ago. My father never updated him. And I never corrected the gap. The preliminary arrest came on a Tuesday morning in March. Selene was in her garden when they arrived. She was wearing old clothes and gardening gloves, and she had dirt on her forearm. She saw the unmarked car and then the uniform behind it, and she pulled off the gloves one finger at a time and folded them and set them on the porch railing. She did not cry. She did not argue. She said, I'd like to call my attorney, and they said she could call from the station. Philippa was already on her way before Selene finished dialing. Kieran held a press release. It was carefully worded. Aldgate Property Group deeply concerned, cooperating fully with authorities, commitment to transparency, internal audit underway. His name appeared once, in the boilerplate leadership acknowledgement at the bottom. He was quoted as saying the matter was a serious breach and that the firm would do whatever was necessary to protect its stakeholders. He did not mention his wife by name. Several local real estate news outlets did. Tanner Sherbrooke was not mentioned anywhere. What Selene did not tell anyone, not Philippa, not her mother when she called, not her sister who flew in from Atlanta the next week, was that she had been moving carefully for 8 months, not reactively, not out of fear, out of knowledge. When she had first noticed the Gmail thread, she had not panicked. She had started a private file on a cloud account that existed on a phone registered to the Okafor Land Trust's operational budget, a phone no one in her household knew about. She had started filling that file slowly, methodically, the way her father had built the land trust, parcel by parcel, document by document, without announcing what was being built. She had also, 8 months ago, retained a separate forensic accounting firm, not connected to Philippa, not connected to Aldgate, not in South Carolina, to audit all financial documents in which her name appeared as a cosign or authorized party over the previous 5 years. The audit had been completed 6 weeks before the fraud investigation began. It contained findings. The wire transfer flagged by Aldgate's compliance team was not the first instance of her signature being used on Aldgate documentation. There were 3 previous authorizations, smaller amounts ranging from $300,000 to $900,000, dating back 22 months. All of them had moved money to entities that dissolved within 90 days of receiving the funds. All of them bore the notary stamp of Quentin Farwell. Total amount moved, approximately $6.8 million. The destination, traced through 2 dissolved LLC and a registered agent in Delaware, was a real estate investment vehicle operating under the name Sherbrooke Capital Ventures. Selene gave Philippa the audit the morning after her release on bond. She watched Philippa read it. She watched Philippa reach the end. She watched Philippa read the last page again. "You've been building this for 8 months, Philippa said. "Yes. And you didn't give this to me when I first brought you in." "I needed to understand what you were going to do with it first," Selene said. "I've watched Aldgate manage information for 11 years. I needed to know you were going to use this to defend me and not to negotiate." Philippa sat back. "Negotiate what?" "My silence," Selene said, "in exchange for the charges going away." Philippa was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I'm here for. I know that now. So what do you want?" Selene looked out the window of the conference room. The street outside was ordinary. A delivery truck, a woman pushing a stroller, a man on his phone walking fast, all of it operating on the assumption that the structures underneath it were solid. "I want them to answer for what they did," Selene said. "Not a settlement, not a negotiated exit. I want this in front of a grand jury. I want every forged document entered into evidence. I want Quentin Farwell's new address in Florida, and I want someone to go talk to him in person, because I do not think he is a man who understood what he was signing up for." Quentin Farwell was indeed not that man. He was 44 years old and had worked in real estate administration for 16 years. He had a daughter starting college in the fall. He had been told by Kieran's personal attorney that the notarizations were routine, a clerical workaround for a situation where Selene was traveling and couldn't come into the office. He had been paid an extra $8,000 over 22 months, deposited as bonuses from a discretionary account Kieran controlled. He had not been told what the documents were actually authorizing. When Philippa's investigator sat across from him in a coffee shop in Clearwater, Florida, and laid out what the documents had been used for, Quentin Farwell was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if he needed his own attorney. Philippa's investigator told him that would probably be a good idea. Quentin Farwell called the DA's office in Charleston 4 days later. The grand jury proceedings took 3 months. During those 3 months, Selene ran the Okafor Land Trust from the same home office with the same garden view. She took calls with her property managers in Georgia and Alabama. She reviewed a proposed conservation easement on a 400-acre parcel in Tennessee. She signed documents, real ones, with real signatures, in front of real notaries, and she sent them where they needed to go. Kieran had moved out of the Ansonborough house 2 weeks after her arrest. He had taken his personal items and his golf clubs and a painting from the upstairs hallway that had belonged to Selene's grandmother. She noted the missing painting on her phone and kept going. Tanner Sherbrooke had stopped showing up to her office the week the DA's inquiry became public. The firm she worked for issued a statement saying she was on an administrative leave of absence. What surfaced during grand jury discovery changed the shape of the story. It had not started as fraud. That was the thing Selene had not been able to understand for a long time. Why Kieran, who was well compensated, who had equity in a successful firm, who had no reason visible from the outside to risk everything, had done it at all. The testimony and documentation that emerged over those 3 months answered the question. Kieran had been quietly attempting to acquire a series of parcels in the Richmond, Virginia corridor, land that was positioned adjacent to a planned federal infrastructure project that would dramatically increase its value. He had identified the acquisition opportunity 18 months before the investigation. He needed capital that wasn't on Aldgate's books, because the acquisition was not something he was authorized to pursue independently. It was the kind of opportunity that should have gone through the full partnership. He had not wanted to share it. Tanner Sherbrooke had found the parcels. Sherbrooke Capital Ventures was the vehicle they had built together to hold them. The forged signatures had been the funding mechanism. The entirety of the scheme rested on one additional assumption, that Selene would not be able to mount a credible defense, because Selene, as far as Kieran understood the situation, had no independent financial resources that weren't connected to him in some traceable way. He knew about the land trust. He thought he knew its value. He had made a calculation. The calculation was wrong by approximately $290 million. The grand jury returned indictments on a Thursday. Kieran Voss, 41 years old, Chief Operating Officer of Aldgate Property Group, was indicted on 8 counts including wire fraud, forgery, misappropriation of corporate funds, and conspiracy. Tanner Sherbrooke, 33 years old, acquisitions associate and principal of Sherbrooke Capital Ventures, was indicted on 6 counts including conspiracy, wire fraud, and receipt of stolen funds. The personal attorney who had briefed Quentin Farwell was placed under separate investigation. Selene heard the news by phone, standing in her garden. The same garden where they had arrested her 4 months earlier. The dirt was dry today. She had been meaning to water the beds near the back fence. She thanked Philippa and ended the call and looked at the garden for a while. Her father called 20 minutes later. She had told him very little during the process, just that there was a legal matter being handled. Just that he shouldn't worry. He was not a man who worried easily. He had watched a great deal happen over 81 years and had concluded that most things resolved themselves if you were patient and honest and did not confuse speed with strength. "It's done?" he said. "The indictments are in," she said. "Good," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "You still have the painting?" She paused. She had not told him about the painting. "He took it," she said. "The one from your grandmother's house." "Yes. It was insured separately," her father said. "Your grandmother arranged that when she gave it to you. I can have the documentation sent to your attorney." Selene almost laughed. She caught herself. "You knew he took it," she said. "Your cousin saw the moving truck," her father said simply. "We noted it." She stood in the garden a little longer after they hung up. The thing about her family was that they noted things. They had always noted things. They moved carefully and quietly, and they kept records, and they waited. Not because they were weak, but because they understood that people who underestimated them consistently provided opportunities that patience could convert into outcomes. Her father had built $340 million of real estate holdings from a single 40-acre parcel. He had done it without ever raising his voice in a meeting. He had done it wearing those reading glasses from the drugstore. She thought about Kiran sitting across from her at the kitchen island with those 4 flat words. The investigation will determine that it had. The Aldgate Property Group restructured its partnership agreement within 6 months of the indictments. Selene was not involved in that process and did not want to be. Her name was cleared in the firm's internal communications in a letter from the managing partners that was careful and correct and about 18 months late. She accepted it without comment. The Richmond parcels that Kiran and Tana had been trying to acquire were still available when the scheme collapsed. The federal infrastructure timeline had slipped, which was the kind of thing that happened with federal infrastructure projects. Several developers had passed on them by then, spooked by the association with the fraud case. The Okafor Land Trust acquired 2 of the parcels in a quiet transaction that closed on a Wednesday afternoon. Selene signed the documents herself. She used her own pen, the one her father had given her when she took over governance of the trust. A plain ballpoint, nothing expensive, the kind of thing you could buy anywhere. Her signature was exactly what it had always been. She filed the closing documents, texted her property manager in Georgia, and went out to water the beds near the back fence before it got dark.